Good evening. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the keynote lecture of our conference on what?
Very long.
It's a very long conference on excessive state power in democracies after 1945, and the keynote lecture by Professor Andreas Wirsching. My name is Dieter Gosewinkel. I'm a historian and lawyer by training, and I had the pleasure to organize this conference. And I'm senior fellow at the Institute. We are dealing with the research hub on democracy, on fault lines of democracy, and this point about excessive state violence and state killings is the, let's say, the opening conference. Okay, I have the pleasure and honor to present tonight's speaker, keynote speaker, Professor Andreas Wirsching, who is historian, to be precise, a contemporary historian. After studying history and Protestant theology in Berlin and Erlangen, his PhD in Erlangen, later habilitation at the University of Regensburg, he became a full professor for German historian standards quite young, at the age of 37, first at the University of Tübingen, afterwards Augsburg, before, and this is important now, before in 2011, he was appointed to the chair of modern and contemporary history at the University of Munich. Moreover, and maybe above all, I may say that because Gabi Metzler is not here, he also became director of the Institute for Zeitgeschichte, Leibniz Institute for Contemporary History. And this institute is among the German research institutions dealing with contemporary history, the institute. The institute, worldwide known for its important and path-breaking studies on the history of National Socialism. Andreas Wirsching held these two positions, chair and director of the institute, held these two positions in Munich, where he developed his, I find, remarkable productivity. His retirement in 2025, as I feel, only meant an organizational caesura, liberating him for further projects of research. Andreas Wirsching carries out research on German and French history in the 20th century, primarily on the history of the Weimar Republic and of communism, fascism, and nationalism. He also works on German and European history post-1970 and on history and theory of modernity. I think you will forgive me if I skip the numerous honors and awards Andreas Wirsching received, among them his membership in the Bavarian Academy of Sciences and Humanities, and he also was invited to various guest professorships, for example, at Sciences Po in Paris. But let's focus on his wide-ranging work, particularly with reference to the topic of our conference. Among the, if I counted well, at least 10 monographic publications, there are three, let's say, big strands of research, three circles. The widest and broadest circle is about German as well as European contemporary history. This plays an important role, and there are at least 3 or even 4 books. Farewell to the provisional status of Germany. It's the history of German unification between 1982 and 1990, came out in 2006. An overall German history, German 20th century history. And then a book on the history of Europe after 1989, The Price of Freedom, European history of our time. And a smaller but also highly interesting book on democracy and globalization, which came out in 2015. There are also, it's the second part, more books more on the history of democracy in particular. His PhD thesis on parliamentary history of England, of early 19th century England, and a collection of articles entitled Demokratie und Gesellschaft, Democracy and Society. And then the third inner circle, let's say, of this broad range of academic writings. These are studies particularly which focus on the threat to democracy, its specific fragility and fragilization, and the dark sides of democracy, particularly during the first half of the 20th century. And I just named the books The Hour of Communism, Die Stunde des Kommunismus, Theory and Practice of Communism, 1900 to 1945, first half of 20th century. Then a book on the Weimar Republic, certainly. And yes, last but not least, Vom Weltkrieg zum Bürgerkrieg, politischer Extremismus in Deutschland und Frankreich 1918 bis 1933-39, in English, From World War to Civil War, question mark, political extremism in Germany and France 1918 to 1939. And this was Andreas Wirsching's habilitation thesis. And if you want to see what it means to write a German habilitation thesis in history, have a look at that. And if you want to, I can show you. This is, I think, the book which is very close to tonight's topic. And democracy and violence comes in, plays a highly important role in this book. Democracy coming under fire from two violent extremist movements between fascism and communism. They fought each other with extreme violence, but with their more or less totalitarian claim of the monopoly on public opinion and information, they also fought what we call liberal democracy today. Wirsching, as a contemporary historian, knows that his topics are deeply involved in politics. In an article he published with the former German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II in 2020, he formulated together with Maas a credo. We cannot, wrote that, we cannot conceive of politics without history. That's why Andreas Wirsching publicly intervenes in debates on current political issues. For example, in an article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, February 2026, where he takes up the concept of so-called militant democracy inherent to the West German constitution and critically asks whether democracy is still militant in Germany in view of its adversaries who challenge the democratic system. And I'm sure this will be part of your talk. In 2015, in your book on democracy and society in Europe, you put forward the thesis that despite right-wing, 2015, despite right-wing populism, there is the, and I quote, chance of structural and even crisis-driven political change of the European party system, while stability, vitality, and capacity for renewal of democracy continue to exist. I wonder whether you want to uphold your thesis. We are very pleased that we are able to get, I think, one of the leading German contemporary historians to give the keynote on democracy and violence. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very, very friendly introduction. But I'm happy that I don't need to answer the question if I would repeat what I said more than 10 years before, because it's the problem with Histoire de notre temps, that this history is overtaking you in the left or in the right, if you like, as you like it, and that is difficult for an historian of our present time. So I'm quite happy to go a little more back into history, and I would like you to, in advance, I would like you to thank you very much for your patience, because I know with our conference it has been a long day, and I know it's sometimes difficult to follow up an evening key lecture, and I hope that I will not be too long. I'm going to speak about 43 or 45 minutes. Both democracy and violence are complex concepts. And reducing this complexity is difficult. I think we saw that during our discussions during this day. Many would probably agree that democracies are less violent than authoritarian regimes. But this idea reflects an inherent modernization theory of progress. And first, there is no comprehensive theory of political violence, I would say. And second, the idea of this peacefulness of democracies depends heavily on the specific conditions and traditions of each democratic system. And that has become clear during our discussions today. For example, is the rule of law upheld in all areas of government policy? Does the free press and media operate effectively? How strong and organized is the political opposition? Are there effective laws and regulations to safeguard human rights and ethnic and cultural minorities? And perhaps most importantly, is there an independent judiciary? We could also consider additional forces. Gabi Metzler via Dieter Gosewinkel has given us a great overview on colonial problems and colonial shadows. So what influence do colonialism and colonial traditions have? Are there imperial ambitions that define certain spheres of interest in which democratic state power is exercised with fewer legal constraints? Finally, how do individualistic or libertarian traditions come into play, such as the right to bear arms, which shall not be infringed, of course, but in fact challenges the state's monopoly on the use of legitimate force? These examples demonstrate the very diverse relationship between democracy and violence. However, it is also important to reflect on the concept of democracy itself. Modern democracy has at least two meanings. On the one hand, it refers to the system of government based on constitutional statutes and institutionalized frameworks of civic participation. But on the other hand, of course, beyond its formal structures, democracy has always been associated with movement, hope, and promise, and all too often with disappointment. Consequently, a persistent tension has emerged between formal democracy and the ideals of democratic justice, equality, and freedom. And it's precisely this tension that very often generates violence. Violence in this context emerges during crises of democratic revolution or consolidation, as well as during periods of state repression. It arises from challenges to the state's monopoly on legitimate force, manifesting itself in mass protests, socially motivated demands, direct actions, or acts of terrorism perpetrated by individuals or marginalized groups. In contrast, economic distress alone rarely results in revolution. While economic distress can ignite spontaneous unrest, it is easy to mistake these events for democratic political movements, such as, for example, the Silesian weavers' uprising in 1844, for example. Spontaneous riots caused by high prices and actual distress were often directed against specific businesses, such as bakeries and groceries. And in these cases, violence can be seen as the result of a sort of moral economy attitude and fits easily into a more traditional pre-industrial pattern of food riots. Indeed, the interplay between political and socio-economic factors as drivers of political violence was one of the most widely debated issues in the theories of violence. I'm not going into a large discussion of theories, but I want at least mention two of them. Ted Gurr's theory of relative deprivation was particularly influential among historians, in this especially also. And according to Gurr, violence is not caused by absolute poverty, but by perceived injustice or unmet expectations. When the gap between people's expectations and their reality becomes unbearable, frustration can lead to political violence. Gurr's theory has its strengths, providing a set of explanations for the individual and psychological motives behind violence at a micro level. Relative deprivation can be a powerful trigger of violence, and as the historian Philip Nord notes, quote, "The downwardly mobile do not always mobilize in resistance, but when a neighbor, with no particular claim to virtue, is thriving amidst the general misfortune, it is hard to contain one's anger. Decline and polarization are the twin conditions that breed resentment." Unquote. I think that is a very important observation and can be verified in many historical situations, I would say. However, Gurr was criticized for underestimating the genuine political factors involved in the mobilization of violence. And most notably, Charles Tilly contributed significantly to this debate. Tilly argued that violence is a form of contentious politics, suggesting that it is not a mere anomaly, but an integral part of how power is negotiated, especially during times of state formation, democratization, or regime change. Violence is just one of several methods groups use to achieve political objectives. Whether they choose violent or non-violent tactics depends on the historical context, their organizational strength, and how the state responds. In my view, both theories offer valuable insights. However, it remains essential to thoroughly examine each individual case and context, and we have done that during the day, partially. And in most cases, economic factors, feelings of deprivation, and political motivations are intertwined and difficult to distinguish. Based on this, I would like to proceed with two steps. First, I will speak on the connection between democracy and violence before the Second World War. For that, I will propose three ideal types of violence. First, revolutionary violence. Second, violent extremism. And third, repressive violence exercised by the democratic state itself. The key subject of our conference. Of course, all three types of violence can often occur simultaneously or can overlap in a single historical event. It's an ideal type, of course. It's not the reality as such. The second train of thought focuses on the period after 1945, the question of how far these three types continue to exist and to what extent they influenced Western democracies after the Second World War. So let's begin then with revolutionary violence. Revolution and the quest for democracy are certainly one of the most powerful mobiles of violence. The transition from an authoritarianism to democracy often involves surges of collective violence as new groups enter the stage and contest the existing power. The classic narrative, or one of the classic narrative, is Marxist-inspired, and of course, in modern times, anti-capitalist sentiments and motives regularly play a significant role. This well-known cartoon, inspired by a Russian flyer from 1901, was published in 1911 by the American newspaper The Industrial Worker, and it's a classic Marxist analysis. The working class is the only productive class, and it said, "We feed all, we are doing the work. The bourgeoisie consumes all added value, and the church's only function is to deceive the people. The systemic tendency of the system toward violence is represented in the center of the drawing when the military of the regime says, "We shoot at you," to protect the bourgeoisie and the ruling class. I'll come back to that cartoon quite in a moment, but I would make some remarks. In historical situations that generate revolutionary violence, political and social motives become intertwined. This is already the case with what we may call proto-democratic revolutionary violence, like, for example, Etienne Marcel's Paris uprising in 1358, or the Peasants' Revolt in Germany in 1525, and there are many, many more examples. And it's especially true for what was to become the role model of democratic revolution, which is, of course, the French Revolution of 1789. Daniel Schönpflug has been talking about that very intensively this morning. From Marx and Engels to Lenin, Albert Soboul and others, the Marxist interpretation of the French Revolution consistently concentrated on the sans-culotte movement and its mass support for democratic revolution. And this was often regarded as an early form of industrial proletariat. Marx considered the French revolutions a sort of ripening class struggle within the French capitalist system. And the brutal suppression of the February Revolution of 1848 and the Paris Commune in 1871 could be seen as bourgeois violence directed against proletarian workers. We shoot at you. In reality, there was no Parisian proletariat at the time. The rebellious masses were primarily drawn from the lower middle classes, artisans, shop floor workers, and domestic laborers, and Paris lacked the large-scale industrial infrastructure required for the emergence of a wage-dependent proletariat. Instead, France, and in particular Paris, developed a sort of Blanquist tradition that romanticized barricade struggles in the past and inspired dreams of new uprisings in the future. And Marx conflated his and Friedrich Engels' experiences in Manchester, where a true proletarian working class did exist, with his materialist theory of history, for which he took as evidence the struggle between les couches populaires of Paris and the French central authorities under the Bourbon, Orleanist, or Bonapartist during the 19th century. As a result, revolutionary violence and its violent suppression were misread as a class struggle. And to come back to that cartoon, it is far too static to adequately illustrate revolutionary violence. First of all, at the workers' level. There would be, of course, the need for political language that could give social and political meaning to the experience of poverty and exploitation. While Marxist language often fulfilled this role, it was historically quite diverse and led to a wide range of actions and ideological justifications. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the German Revolution of 1918-19 were prime examples, as Marxist socialism was deeply divided in both cases. The strongly voluntaristic rhetoric of the left wing sought to force a violent revolution toward a Soviet-style dictatorship, often without much regard for the specific needs of the workers. And additionally, other discourses such as civic universalism and humanism, especially those rooted in the French tradition, could also play a major role. So we need meaning for poverty. We need meaning of poverty and exploitation in order to have a revolutionary violent situation. And that leads second to the bourgeois level and to the level of the functional elites and the military. Typically, a significant division among social and functional elites is required to trigger revolutionary violence. In terms of Charles Tilly's theory, that might have been brokers, like warlords or political entrepreneurs, who connected disparate groups to violent action. The German Revolution of 1918-19 offers a clear example for that. During the revolution and the early days of the Weimar Republic, both the working class movement and the political elite were deeply fractured. Weary and demoralized by the war, no one was willing anymore to support the Kaiser, who seemed to have become the main obstacle to peace. Extremist rhetoric further fueled the conflict, resulting in political violence from both sides. So the division of this level is also needed for the ignitement and the development of political violence in a very typological argument. Now, the Weimar Republic is probably the best example for the role of violent extremism in democratic regimes, and that brings me to my second point, and it refers a little bit to what you said in your introduction, violence between extremists and extremist groups. Violent extremism results in a form of violence directed against political opponents within a democratic system. Liberal democracy, with a central element such as universal suffrage and the guarantee of freedom of expression and assembly, was the necessary prerequisite for it. Taking full advantage of the political and civil liberties of democracy, extremist groups used violence as a method to political confrontation. Radical anti-democrats like communists, Nazis, and other right-wing circles invoked a higher morality and a political will that transcended democratic elections, the true people, or in French you could say le pays réel, which is behind or beyond the constitutional forms to get a political will. And in this context, violence was used as a calculated and targeted provocation. On the one hand, it manifested in the form of political mass mobilization and paramilitary organization. By occupying public space, the political presence and strength of the extremist movements were symbolically represented. On the other hand, severe physical attacks on political opponents, but also against police forces as they sought to maintain public order, became in Weimar an everyday occurrence. Extremist movements legitimized their use of political violence by claiming self or social defense, and in doing so, they were careful to remain within the bounds of legality so as not to limit their own ability to act. Adolf Hitler's tactics of legality, Legalitätstaktik, are the best known examples of this, though communists employed similar tactics. In both cases, the goal of political violence was to establish a virtual monopoly on propaganda. The goal was simply to silence the opponents. This type of bipolar confrontation represented a political concept that, according to Carl Schmitt, reckoned with the real possibility, the physical possibility of civil war. Violence is, in Charles Tilly's words, contentious politics. Now, Italian fascism, to some extent Hitler's role model, was of course also very influenced by the experience of war, albeit in a different role. Fascism was a hybrid movement incorporating revolutionary elements, extreme nationalism, and strong anti-socialism. And to some extent, Mussolini himself was the decisive political broker who connected these different forces by his own personality and the ideology of the Duce. By 1920, parallel to the stunning electoral successes of the socialists, a new synthesis of revolutionary syndicalism, radical nationalism, and juvenile combattantismo emerged, tinged with a Sorelian thinking and with an implacable hatred of Marxian socialism. Like in Germany, violence was legitimized as a form of self-defense. Thus, during the Biennio Rosso, 1919-1920, Mussolini's quadristi used excessive violence against trade unions and political opponents by, quote, defending Italy from Bolshevism, as they claimed. But in fact, like in Germany, fascist violence was directed against the enemy from within. Now, the endemic potential for violence in the Weimar Republic and in Italian fascism is well known. However, the form of violent extremism described here existed throughout Europe, albeit on a lesser level. It was a distinctive feature of the interwar period, though in a much lesser degree in most countries than in Italy and Germany. One might only think of the late French Third Republic or Hungary with its backlash of Bela Kun's Soviet Republic. Yet the challenge posed by Bolshevism and the militant anti-communism it provoked also paved the way for the third type of violence in democracy I would like to discuss. This is repressive violence exercised by the democratic state. This type of violence also eludes clear theoretical classification, I would say. In any case, however, the state's ability to enforce its measures is crucial. The strength and effectiveness of the democratic state's monopoly on the legitimate use of force is variable. In Italy, for example, the liberal central state and its constitutional government lacked the power of enforcing their authority in the provinces. In regions where law and order were insufficiently enforced, political violence became more frequent. The history or the rise of fascism mirrored these problems of Italian political culture. In a society which had been built along local and regional communities, it was the provincial ras who emerged as the almost omnipotent fascist leader in the early 20s. The squadrismo also did not spring up from an industrial mass society, but from provincial communities. In contrast, things were different in the Weimar Republic. The democratic state became involved because its monopoly on the use of legitimate force was challenged by anti-democratic agitation. If we compare these both histories, it's clear that the Weimar state reacted much more strongly against the challenge of its monopoly of violence than that was the case in Italy at the beginning of the 1920s. And this sometimes resulted in repressive or even excessive violence by democratic authorities in Germany. A situation specific of post-war Germany was that the young democratic state possessed hardly any executive power of its own at the beginning. And this was the backdrop for the highly controversial cooperation between the democratic central government and the imperial army, during which the notorious Free Corps were formed. They were called die Freikorps. They were called to defend democracy, but had in fact their own political agenda, which was directed against this new democracy. So violence was primarily directed against the communists or against those who were believed to be communist in 1919. In 1919, the left-wing revolutionary movements in Berlin and Munich were brutally suppressed. Martial law was undisguised and legitimized as defensive measure. Murder was reinterpreted as, quote, militarily necessary shooting and an act of self-defense. And in 1920, in the wake of the failed right-wing Kapp-Lüttwitz putsch, the left-wing Red Army, so-called Red Army in the Ruhr area, was the last revolutionary mass movement in Germany. Numbering around 50,000 armed men, it controlled the Ruhr industrial region after fierce fighting with Reichswehr units and the security police. After unsuccessful attempts by the Reich government to reach an agreement with the rebels, government troops began marching into the Ruhr region. And again, they were supported in their fight against Bolshevism by free corps. And the suppression of the uprising was accompanied by extreme cruelty on both sides, claiming the lives of around 1,000 rebels and over 200 Reichswehr soldiers. So the number of victims of this sort of violence numbers thousands. Also in 1919, alone in March 1919 in Berlin were more of 1,000 rebels left dead. A final example is, of course, the famous so-called Bloody May on May the 1st, 1929, when the Berlin police used disproportionate measures to break up an unauthorized demonstration. 13,000 police officers took violent action against demonstrators. In the end, there were 20 dead and around 200 injured. That is a distortion of legal, moral, and political categories in the enforcement of the state's monopoly on violence, and it became apparent from the very beginning of the Weimar Republic. State violence was almost exclusively directed against communists or those who were believed to be communists. Hitler and the National Socialists rode the wave of rhetoric that had been set in motion, and the longer it lasted, the better it was for them. Thus, in August 1932, SR leader Ernst Röhm could openly and cynically justify the brutal murder of a young defenseless communist in Potempa, Upper Silesia, by his SA men. It's a SA men. In regions particularly threatened by communism, he said, quote, severe self-defense and retaliation had been exercised. But that did not stop the Catholic Center Party from considering forming a governing coalition with the NSDAP at that very moment when Hitler and Röhm legitimized murder publicly and openly. That means even years before 1933, the bourgeois circles of Weimar Germany had developed a general acceptance of both legal and extra-legal violence, provided it was directed against the right opponents. Under the influence of this and Weimar's one-sided justice, which prioritized equally the persecution of communists, the state's monopoly on the use of legitimate force began to erode. And that is a clear parallel to Italian fascism, but also to some aspects of other countries, for example, the French history after World War I, that consisted of the feeling that there existed a well-organized red menace and a weak constitutional government that did not seem to be capable of ensuring public order and social defense anymore. As the former French president Alexandre Millerand put it in 1925, when political violence ran high in France and fears mounted about left-wing unrest, I quote, if there is violence and shooting, there must be no doubt about the resistance being organized by the same methods, even if this is indeed a cruel duty, unquote. So it was that sort of rhetoric from which in Germany, Hitler was able to take profit. In 1933, the fight against communism became the strongest common ground between the emerging Nazi dictatorship and most of the German society. No slogan resonated as strongly as Hitler's rallying cry for the destruction of Marxism, Vernichtung des Marxismus. This program of destruction of Marxism gave the Führer a long-lasting credit among the middle classes, which in my opinion is still underestimated as a common ground for the creation of the dictatorship. Now, let me come to my second train of thought and the question of how far these three ideal types I mentioned continue to exist after 1945 and to what extent they influenced Western democracies. And I will again proceed with three considerations. First, what remains today of what I previously described as revolutionary violence. Purely economic motives now play a much smaller role, I would say, in the relationship between democracy and violence than before the World War II or even the 19th century. There is little evidence of violent mass movements motivated solely by economic grievances, although social and economic anxieties often form the background for protest, of course. This change is largely due to a long period of economic prosperity. And this change is clear. I mean, the boom and les Trente Glorieuses have had its impact in that respect. That has dramatically reduced hardships in Western democracies. Furthermore, the democratization process itself has helped alleviate or redirect economic discontent. Elections, trade unions, political parties, and social organizations all serve as important channels for addressing social and economic issues. There are, however, notable exceptions, and these mainly involve protests by specific occupational groups who, as a result of broader economic shifts, perceived their livelihood to be at risk. For instance, well-known example, the miners' strike in Britain, 1984-1985, illustrate this trend. The most prominent examples are, however, found in France, I would say, and I think it's not a coincidence that we have spoken a lot of France during this conference. In Brittany, for example, les Bonnets Rouges movement began in October 2013 as a protest against a new environmental tax on truck transport. This tax was to be enforced by cameras installed along highways to monitor heavy vehicles for toll collection, a fiscal measure, so to speak. And the movement escalated, resulting in the destruction of hundreds of such cameras and a very strong governmental response. 11 individuals were convicted of conspiracy and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 4 to 18 months. The economic protest of the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, in 2018-19 was socially more widespread. It originated in the provinces as a peaceful movement against rising fuel prices, a very current subject. And as the demonstrations advanced toward Paris in December 2018, militant activists assumed leadership and violent confrontations erupted with police and security forces. Protesters set fire to cars, buildings, and luxury stores, while police responded with water cannons, tear gas, and rubber bullets. Over 400 individuals were arrested in a single day, and by mid-2019, the protests had resulted in 11 fatalities, at least 2,500 injured protesters, and 1,800 injured police officers. The political undertones in the Yellow Vest movement quickly became apparent, such as the demands for President Macron's resignation and for local referendums. Typologically, however, the uprisings of the Bonnets Rouges and the Yellow Vests, in my opinion, stand out as a very specific movement. And 2 comments on this. First, it is no coincidence that such a movement took place in France. Parties and associations that channel political protest are organizationally much weaker in France than, for example, in Germany. This means that the individual in France faces the Republican state much more directly and without mediation. As a result, the path to direct action is considerably shorter. Secondly, for decades of neoliberal rhetoric and policy reforms have increasingly placed social and economic responsibility on individuals resulting in heightened market vulnerability. As a result, it is possible that, given different circumstances, traditional forms of protest could resurface. This would represent a new type, an old but new type of spontaneous, unorganized, violent protest directed against specific objects and actors, or even against the abstract state itself, which is blamed for generating concrete hardships. Such a form of protest would more closely resemble, to point it a little bit, resemble pre-modern spontaneous revolts than modern, in quotation marks of course, democratic revolutionary movements. And as I demonstrated earlier, they were directed against fiscal measures and inflation and guided by a sense of moral economy. But that needs to be discussed if this is really an old, new type of violence against which democracies react more or less strongly. That is open to discussion, of course. Classic revolutionary violence was far more evident during the 1968 movement in countries such as West Germany, France, and the United States. These uprisings were fueled by political motives rather than economic ones, even though French trade unions showed solidarity with student protesters. In Germany, the protests centered first on opposition to the Shah regime in Persia, the American war in Vietnam, and dissatisfaction with authoritarian domestic politics. Anti-parliamentary sentiment, anti-capitalism, and radical democratic traditions converged in Germany in calls for a revolutionary overhaul of the political system. 50 years after the November Revolution, it was no coincidence that demands for council democracy, Räterepublik, re-emerged at that time. In France, the movement was mainly directed against Gaullist authoritarianism and included demands, as in Germany, for university reforms, workers' rights, sexual liberation, and broader opposition to Gaullist policies. In the United States, the central issues were draft resistance during the Vietnam War, civil rights, and economic inequality for Black Americans, as well as campus revolts demanding curriculum reform, and the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy further intensified the already heated atmosphere. So while I can just shortly touch upon these sorts of political tension and violence, of course, for reasons of time. So I come to the second type of violence, that is violent extremism. And this has been rising in recent years. The confrontations between far left and far right extremists are emerging, and this seems to me a dangerous trend, especially in Europe and the United States. Almost most protests remain peaceful, but radical elements on both sides are increasingly willing to resort to violence, posing a significant threat to public order and democratic stability. Violence as contentious politics. Contributing factors include growing polarization and political division, amplified by social media and misinformation. Global crises such as immigration, wars, and pandemics have also created fertile ground for extremism. Additionally, police brutality, economic inequality, and debates over globalization, gender rights, and so on can function as triggers for this type of violence. The far right often uses demonstrations, organized marches, provocations, and attacks on migrants to assert their presence in public life, while the far left employs blockades, property destruction, and direct confrontations with far-right extremists, actions now commonly recently referred anew to Antifa tactics. Antifa has become an old, new concept, summarized concept of far-left activity. As a result of this polarization, street battles and violent clashes between extremists have become more frequent. And as you know, one of the most recent cases, again France, in France has been the death of Quentin Derongue, a young far-right activist linked to the Rassemblement National. And he died in Lyon after being severely beaten during a violent clash between far-right and far-left groups. The killing has been compared to a Charlie Kirk moment for France, symbolizing the escalation of political violence between extremist factions. And if I'm well informed, there's an ongoing discussion in France, which becomes more and more heated, as to this polarization between, in fact, La France Insoumise on the one hand and the Rassemblement National on the other hand. And in my opinion, this will probably, in other countries too, be a sort of perspective for the near future that these sorts of polarization will increase. We normally look to the far right, of course, as the main threat to political stability, but this sort of polarization is a very realistic perspective, in my opinion. So, to my third point, dangers of repressive violence. I mean, we heard today a lot of this type of violence, democratic violence, and frequently the democratic state responded with excessive police violence and repression to protest movements. During the 1968 unrest, baton charges and tear gas were widely used, and in the United States, the military was even deployed. Thousands of people were arrested and many suffered abuse while in detention. Therefore, the movements of 1968 and the way they were suppressed can be regarded perhaps as a turning point, marking a shift from a more traditional authoritarian style of democratic governments to demands for more democracy focused on greater equality and justice. This tension between formal democracy and the ideas of a progress of social democracy was very clear at work in the 1960s and early 1970s. In this sense, 1968 symbolizes the conflict between formal democracy and the expression of expansive, sometimes utopian aspirations that were historically associated with the idea of democracy. The aftermath of the protests and the state's forceful response varied across countries. In West Germany, the events of 1968 led directly to a minority embracing terrorism, most notably the Red Army faction, the RAF. In the United States, government violence deepened internal divisions and ultimately strengthened both the civil rights movement and radical opposition to the war in Vietnam. In France, and similarly in the US, this experience fostered enduring distrust toward the police and government. But after what we heard from Vincent Nouzil and Fabien Joubard, I'm not so sure if this distrust towards police and government really exists in France. I would have thought so, but that's perhaps open to discussion how far this is true. There are, of course, different forms of police force and police violence, and perhaps we need to distinguish between certain incidences. At least I would say that in the Paris region, of course, the banlieue, which are inhabited by many immigrants, this distrust against police is very strong, while perhaps in the bourgeois center of Paris, it doesn't exist, or in some provinces it doesn't exist. That is open to discussion. But nevertheless, the general trend seems to me to be that this 1968 suppression of rather fierce suppression of the movement in these three countries has enhanced the distrust to police. I mean, in Germany, it's quite clear. All these ideas of de-escalation of police forces and so on begin in the 1970s, and this is, of course, a part of a reaction of the polarization and the violence which took place in the 1968 movement. So when it comes to violence between political extremists, my second ideal type, police often struggle to contain these outbreaks of violence and are sometimes accused of favoring one side over the other. Such accusations can be problematic as they echo the rhetoric of legitimate defense and self-defense used by fascist and communist movements between the world wars. The underlying aim is to challenge again the state's monopoly on violence and to justify militant self-help. And there are, I know it for sure for Germany, but I think in France, even in UK, let alone the US, there are tendencies for organization of such a self-help group. Bürgerwehren, for example, as it's called in Germany. So extra-legal small organizations that are demanding their own right to intervene and to protect property or political groups. This is, in my opinion, also a precarious development. Overall, the topic reveals how little democracies are free from violent conflicts, and I have not yet addressed then the violence that stems from the shadows of colonial, imperial, and racist traditions of the West, meaning late colonial confrontations such as the Algerian War in France and its consequences, we heard about that, race riots in the UK and in the US, nor have I discussed targeted killings, which was the central focus of today's and tomorrow's conference. And I cannot speak now about so-called structural violence, which is also inherent in free societies. That would be another subject. But in any case, it's hardly possible to speak of a linear development from authoritarian violence-prone regimes to ever more peaceful democracies. I would say this is a illusion of a modernist or a modernization theory which cannot be upheld. Again, both in history and the present, it depends on the specific circumstances. If the rule of law is consistently maintained, if the press operates freely and efficiently, if there's a well-organized political opposition and so forth. So, in my opinion, it's difficult to formulate a general theory of these types of violence in our times. And as a historian, I would say it's very important to analyze the concrete, specific constellations to have an idea what happened. So this brings me to my concluding remarks. They address a fundamental dilemma of democracy, of course, first articulated in 1937 by the German Jewish political scientist Karl Löwenstein. While in exile, Löwenstein introduced the concept of militant democracy, in German dann wehrhafte Demokratie, and posed a crucial question. What actions should defenders of democracy take against its enemies? And of course, he had the experience of Weimar and the early Nazi regime before his eyes. How far can democratic liberty and tolerance extend without enabling those who oppose them to ultimately destroy these very principles? This dilemma arises from the ongoing tension between a formal democracy, which with its constitutional framework, liberties and regulations that must be protected, and the ambitions of its critics and opponents who often seek to promote entirely different ideas and ideologies. And in this context, or this is the context in which the question of violence must be reconsidered, particularly when it comes to protecting public safety and order, which are core responsibilities even in a liberal state. It also concerns judiciary and how fundamental rights such as freedom of speech and assembly are managed. Does the repression of anti-democratic movements threaten democracy itself, or conversely, are democracy and its supporters to be defended even by robust means if necessary? This is a question which has become increasingly urgent in recent times, largely due to the surge in politically motivated crimes. For example, Germany witnessed a 40% increase in such offenses in 2024, marking the highest level since records began, an upsurge of politically motivated crimes. While most incidents were attributed to far-right actors, there has also been a notable rise in anti-Semitic attacks and violence targeting politicians from across the political spectrum, and attacks coming also from the far left. In any case, ideological polarization and the proliferation of misinformation can foster support for extremism and violence, undermining democratic discourse in public institutions. So it is evident, in my opinion, that the resilience of democracies relies on the capacity of governments, legal authorities, civil society, and the media to promote dialogue, transparency, and peaceful conflict resolution. Robust measures in militant democracy may include the banning of extremist parties and organizations, the prohibition, the revocation of fundamental rights for individual extremists, and, if necessary, the restriction of freedom of assembly. And these are the instruments of a militant democracy which are in itself markers for this democratic dilemma. How far can a democracy go in order to protect its substance? The limits are certainly reached where democratic governments themselves resort to violence, of which we heard many examples today. Resort to violence, employ autocratic tactics or intransparent tactics, and violate the principles of constitutional loyalty and the rule of law. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Andreas Wirsching, for this very broad historical picture and the theories which you mentioned, which played quite an important role in the structure of your keynote. So I think to give some time to those of you who want to ask questions, I would like to start. One, except in the part on revolutionary violence, one might get the impression that violence and democracy are counterparts. They are something like contradictory. There seems to be not only a tension, but some real conflict between these two terms. I wonder if you mean that, and I would like to differentiate that a bit. Violence is not only destructive, violence can also be very productive to bring up democracy and to stabilize democracy. So I would say there is not only a negative relationship between the two, but there may also be something like a supportive, a positive relationship. Violence, for example, revolutionary violence was absolutely necessary to bring democracy upon, to bring it to birth against, let's say, authoritarian, monarchical, ancien regime types of government. So I wonder whether you share this opinion or not. And this would be one question. Another question is about the tension between democratic ideals and their realization, and the lack of deficit of realization. This seems to have played a role, for example, in the 1968 movement. You mentioned that. But is this something which is a problem for today's European societies? Is that an explanation for the uprise of populism and anti-liberal populism and ideas of anti-liberal democracy? If anti-liberal ideas of democracy can be seen as democratic. This is a conceptual question, but these two questions.
Yeah, thanks very much. First of all, as to the first question, I think I would agree with what you said, but I would differentiate it along historical lines. I mean, in the formation of democratic movements and the establishment of a democratic state, violence is a historically necessary element, I would say. It's very difficult to see, even in the UK, these election reforms of the 19th century are almost always accompanied by the menace of revolution and the menace of violence. Without the reform acts of the 19th century enlarging the suffrage would not have been possible, I would say. So I completely agree, and I mean, we heard this morning by Daniel Schönpflug, who is among us, I think, how ambivalent even the la terreur needs to be analyzed and considered if we think of political violence. When it is productive or not, or dangerous, is, in my opinion, only answerable if you make a concrete analysis of a certain constellation, in my opinion. But this is history, and I must say I also think that there is, by the way of the establishment of a democratic state, the question of the modern state's monopoly on the use of legitimate force. And this is, in my opinion, no small problem. So I think it's, I mean, you can of course argue that this is a sort of modernization theory or civilization theory, but I think I'm of the opinion that the establishment of democracies with a Rechtsstaat, with a liberal rule of law, have some advantages, historically speaking. And if this monopoly on legitimate force of use of force erodes, then you have an escalation, or you risk to have an escalation of violence, which is classically observable between the wars, but which is also today under pressure, I would say. So when is it productive, when it's not? And I come to your second question as to 1968 and today. I would say 1968 was productive. I mean, violence escalated, as far as I can see, escalated from the polarization between protest and police response, excessive police response. I mean, 1967 in Germany, it's classic with Benno Ohnesorg, etc., which was a catalyst for violence from both sides. And in my opinion, 1968 in the three countries I mentioned, as far as I can judge about that, were, if you like, perhaps the last emanations of an etatist idea of what a state is and how it has to react against challenges of social and political protest. And insofar, I would consider 1968 as a watershed. It's not so easy anymore to have this etatist use of excessive violence against protesters. I mean, of course, we have examples for that, anti-globalization protests like in Hamburg, for example, or 1st May protests in Berlin, which has a ritualistic character in the meantime, are regularly accompanied by violence from both sides, of course. But in general, I would say 1968 is an important watershed. And so probably today, this question of what I try to mention as revolutionaries, violence is not so much our problem today, I would agree. Which is interesting, I hadn't the time to elaborate that, is what happened in 1989 with revolutionary movements in the Eastern Communist bloc. And that was Romania left aside. I mean, in Germany we say die friedliche Revolution, and in general it was surprisingly peaceful. And I mean, you can discuss why this was the reason. Why was this the case? I would say there's. I think it was also Richard Löwenthal. I think it was Richard Löwenthal who introduced this idea of an anti-chaos reflex, meaning that if you have a society which is deeply divided or strongly characterized by a division of labor, you risk a chaos if some movements are getting out of control and become completely violent. And this is, to some extent, an anti-chaos reflex. Löwenthal considered the German November Revolution as such an example, but I think in 1989 it's even more valuable. I mean, the avoidance of a Chinese, so-called Chinese solution in the ex-GDR, for example, may point in that direction. But that's another subject, because it's not democracies, but it's communist regimes which react to democratic movements. But in general, I would say today the Western democracies are confronted with different types of violence and different types of challenges, if you like, and also with different types of state reactions than in the 1960s. If this answers your question a little bit.
Thank you.